The Appalachian Trail had always called to me, not as a destination for adventure or solace, but as an enigma I needed to unravel, a vast stretch of wilderness shrouded in myths and whispers of the unexplainable. So when I set out alone on an overcast morning in late October, armed with little more than a backpack, a map, and the reckless confidence of someone who didn't quite believe in the supernatural, I had no inkling that I was stepping into a nightmare from which I might never fully return. The first days were uneventful, the trail winding through rolling hills and thick forests ablaze with autumn colors, the crunch of leaves underfoot a soothing rhythm to my otherwise restless thoughts. But then, somewhere between Hot Springs and Roan Mountain, things began to change in ways I couldn't ignore. It started subtly, a shadow flitting just beyond my peripheral vision, the sudden and absolute silence of the forest as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, and the unnerving feeling that I was being watched, though every time I turned around, I found nothing but the empty trail behind me. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An abandoned campsite, its tent shredded and belongings scattered as though whoever had been there had fled in a hurry. A notebook lay half buried in the dirt, its pages water-stained but legible, filled with frantic scrawls about whispers in the dark, and a path that leads nowhere. I told myself it was the work of an over-imaginative hiker or someone who had simply lost their grip on reality. But as the sun dipped below the horizon that night and the forest around me grew unnaturally quiet, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. That night, I was woken by a sound I couldn't place. A low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself, vibrating through my bones and making the hairs on my neck stand on end. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening as the hum grew louder, joined by a series of guttural clicks and whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip my tent and shine my flashlight into the surrounding darkness, the beam illuminated nothing but the gnarled trunks of trees and the dense underbrush. Yet the sounds persisted, growing fainter as if retreating into the depths of the forest. The following day, the trail markers became sporadic, their familiar white blazes replaced by strange symbols carved into the bark of trees, symbols that made my stomach churn the longer I looked at them. My GPS, which had been my reliable companion up until that point, began to glitch, the screen flickering and displaying nonsensical coordinates. As I pressed on, the terrain grew more rugged and unrecognizable, the once well-trodden path giving way to a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to lead me deeper into the heart of an uncharted wilderness. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches forming a canopy so dense that even in broad daylight, the forest floor was cloaked in perpetual twilight. Around midday, I came across a clearing, its center dominated by a massive stone monolith etched with the same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees. The air here was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic tang that made my throat burn and my eyes water. I wanted to turn back, to retrace my steps and leave this place behind. But the moment I did, I found myself staring at the same clearing, the monolith standing silently as if mocking my attempt to escape. Panic set in as I realized I was walking in circles, the forest around me warping and shifting in ways that defied logic or reason. That night, I didn't bother setting up camp, instead huddling beneath the roots of an enormous tree, my knife clutched tightly in one hand as I tried to stay awake. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came the faint outline of figures moving through the trees, tall, emaciated silhouettes with eyes that glowed like dying embers. They didn't approach, but their presence was enough to send my mind spiraling into a state of near hysteria. By the time dawn broke, I was running on pure adrenaline, determined to find my way back to the main trail, but the forest seemed to have other plans. The path I followed led me to an old wooden bridge spanning a chasm so deep that its bottom was lost to shadow. As I stepped onto the bridge, the wood creaked ominously, and a sudden gust of wind howled through the ravine, carrying with it a voice that called my name in a tone so familiar it made my chest ache. Against my better judgment, I turned, and what I saw nearly made me collapse. The figure standing at the other end of the bridge was me, or at least something that looked like me, its features distorted and wrong in ways I can't fully describe. It raised a hand in a mocking wave before stepping back into the shadows, leaving me paralyzed with fear. Somehow, I made it across the bridge and into a part of the forest that felt marginally less hostile, but the sense of being watched never left me. The trail markers were completely gone now, replaced by those same unsettling symbols, and the forest seemed alive in a way that made every step feel like an intrusion. Around midday, I stumbled upon a small cabin, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar, a thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney. Desperation overrode caution, and I approached, hoping to find another person, someone who could help me navigate my way out of this nightmare. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of murky liquid, each containing something unidentifiable but vaguely organic. A table in the center of the room held a single, flickering candle and a book bound in what looked disturbingly like leather, its pages filled with the same incomprehensible symbols I'd seen throughout the forest. As I reached for the book, the door slammed shut behind me, and the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. I don't remember much after that, only fragments. An overwhelming sense of dread, the feeling of hands grasping at me from the shadows, and a voice that whispered secrets I was never meant to hear. When I woke, I was lying on the side of a road, my clothes torn and my body covered in scratches and bruises. A passing driver took me to the nearest town, but when I tried to explain what had happened, the locals only exchanged uneasy glances and warned me never to return to that part of the trail. Weeks later, I found myself obsessively researching the Appalachian Trail, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced, but no maps or accounts mention the symbols, the monolith, or the cabin. It's as if that part of the trail doesn't exist, or worse, as if it exists only for those unfortunate enough to stumble upon it. Even now, I wake in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers, the same guttural voices I heard in the forest, and I know, deep down, that I left a part of myself behind on that cursed trail, a part that's still wandering, lost and searching, in a place that shouldn't exist. I'd heard the stories before I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail, a 6-month trek through untamed wilderness, solitude, and breathtaking beauty, but nothing could have prepared me for the darkness that awaited me deep in the heart of the trail. It was early October when I started, the crisp autumn air cutting through the dense forest as leaves painted in fiery hues blanketed the ground. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wildlife or distant hoot of an owl. I had been walking for days, passing the scattered shelters and crossing paths with the occasional hiker who would nod in silent camaraderie. By the time I reached Silent Hollow, a remote and seldom visited stretch of the trail, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Silent Hollow was infamous among hikers. Whispers of strange disappearances, unearthly sounds, and eerie apparitions followed its name like a ghostly shadow. Yet, I dismissed the rumors as mere campfire tales. Exhausted and aching, I set up my small tent near a clearing and prepared for the night. As the darkness deepened, an unsettling quiet wrapped around the forest like a suffocating blanket. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving an oppressive stillness that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise, low, guttural, and inhuman. My heart pounded as I strained to hear, every nerve in my body on edge. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could swear it was coming from the trees directly behind my tent. Gripping my flashlight, I unzipped the flap and shone the beam into the inky blackness. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled branches of the ancient oaks. But what caught my breath was not the trees. It was the pair of eyes staring back at me. Reflective, yellow, and unblinking, they hovered at a height that no animal I knew could reach. Paralyzed, I could only stare as the figure stepped into view. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to writhe and shift, as though it couldn't decide on a single shape. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over its bony frame. The thing emitted a low growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate in my chest, filling me with a primal terror I had never known. Without thinking, I scrambled out of my tent and ran, leaving everything behind. My flashlight bounced wildly as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and clothes. The creature followed, its guttural growls growing louder, its heavy footfalls echoing in the night. No matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just beyond the reach of my light. The forest seemed endless, the trail I had been following for days now an unrecognizable maze. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, collapsing to my knees as my lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest. The silence returned, deafening and oppressive. I dared to look back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The creature was gone, but the shadows seemed alive, twisting and coiling as though the forest itself was watching me. I stayed there, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. The forest, bathed in the soft glow of morning, seemed almost serene, as if the horrors of the night were nothing more than a bad dream. But when I made my way back to the campsite to retrieve my gear, it was gone. Tent, pack, even the fire pit I had built, all vanished without a trace. In its place was a single item, an old, rusted lantern, its glass cracked and blackened with soot. I didn't touch it. Instead, I turned and walked, faster than I'd ever hiked before, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and Silent Hollow. Days later, when I finally reached a small town and shared my story with the locals, their faces turned ashen. An elderly man leaned in close, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Silent Hollow ain't no place for the living," he whispered. "They say it's where the veil's thinnest, where things that don't belong here cross over. You were lucky to make it out." Lucky. The word felt hollow as I sat alone in my motel room that night, staring at the mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of yellow eyes staring back at me before the reflection returned to normal. The memory of Silent Hollow still haunts me, the growls echoing in my dreams and the phantom eyes watching me from the shadows of my mind. I thought I had left the darkness behind on the trail, but now I know, once Silent Hollow marks you, it never truly lets you go. When I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail alone, it wasn't for the views or the challenge. I needed an escape, a place where the incessant hum of city life, the glare of screens, and the weight of responsibilities couldn't reach me. But what I found instead was something far darker than the isolation I sought. A horror that even now makes me doubt my own sanity. The first few days were uneventful, the trail winding through breathtaking landscapes, the crisp air filling my lungs with a kind of freedom I hadn't felt in years. But everything changed when I reached a segment of the trail the locals ominously called Devil's Ridge. The name struck me as melodramatic, a relic of old superstitions. But as I climbed higher into the dense, misty woods, the atmosphere thickened with a palpable tension. The trees here were ancient and gnarled, their moss-covered trunks twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like frozen gestures of agony. By the time the sun began to set, the trail had become a narrow, rocky path hemmed in by cliffs on one side and a sheer drop on the other, and with nowhere else to camp, I set up my tent in a small clearing tucked beneath a massive oak tree whose branches stretched out like skeletal arms against the darkening sky. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural moan, faint at first but growing louder and more insistent, echoing through the stillness like the wail of something not quite human. My flashlight's beam pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense wall of trees around me. Yet the sound persisted, now accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves, circling my campsite with unnerving precision. Every hair on my body stood on end as I clutched my knife, my heart pounding like a drum in the oppressive silence that followed. But the footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they had begun, leaving me in a deafening quiet that seemed to press against my ears like cotton. When dawn broke, I found no evidence of anyone or anything. Having been there, though the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind as I packed up and continued along the trail. The next day was worse. As I descended into a shadowy ravine, the air grew unnaturally cold, and the light seemed to dim despite the cloudless sky above. Then I saw it, an old, dilapidated cabin nestled in a hollow at the base of the ridge, its windows dark and its door hanging askew as if inviting me in. I should have ignored it, kept walking, but something about the place drew me closer, a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and decay, and the floorboards groaned underfoot as I explored. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood, and in the center of the single room stood a crude wooden altar, stained dark with something I dared not identify. As I turned to leave, a sudden, icy draft slammed the door shut, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the narrow beams of light filtering through the cracks in the walls. That's when I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, watching me from the shadows. My chest tightened as a faint whisper brushed against my ear, unintelligible but undeniably real. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, tripping over the threshold and stumbling back onto the trail. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, my lungs burning and my legs trembling with exhaustion. That night, the dreams began. Vivid and horrifying, they showed me glimpses of grotesque rituals. Shadowy figures gathered around the altar, chanting in a guttural language that made my ears ache. Each morning, I woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of the dreams lingering in my mind like a toxin I couldn't shake. The trail itself seemed to twist and warp, the markers growing sparse and unfamiliar, as if the forest was deliberately trying to disorient me. Then came the voices, faint at first, but growing louder as the days wore on, calling my name from just beyond the tree line, taunting me with promises of safety if I'd only step off the path. I resisted, but the temptation gnawed at me, the primal fear of being hunted driving me to the brink of madness. On the seventh night, it finally showed itself. I was camped near a shallow creek, the moonlight casting long shadows across the water, when I heard the unmistakable sound of breathing low, wet, and ragged, coming from the other side of the creek. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, landing on a figure that defied all logic and reason. It was tall and emaciated, its skin pale and translucent, stretched tightly over a skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin, revealing jagged teeth that looked more like shards of bone. It took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I realized with mounting terror that it wasn't walking. It was floating, its feet never touching the ground. My legs refused to move as it reached the edge of the creek and stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. Then it spoke, its voice a rasping hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You should not have come here. You are mine now." The paralysis broke, and I ran, abandoning my gear as I tore through the forest, branches slashing at my face and arms. The creature's laughter followed me, a chilling sound that grew louder and more manic the further I went. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto a narrow road, the laughter stopped, leaving me in an eerie, oppressive silence. A passing car found me hours later, disoriented and covered in scratches, but I couldn't explain what had happened. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me, waiting for the day I'll return to the trail and fulfill whatever dark purpose it has in store. I've tried to move on, to convince myself it was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, I know the truth. The Appalachian Trail isn't just a place of natural beauty. It's a gateway to something ancient and malevolent, and those who venture too far into its depths may never return. The Appalachian Trail had always been a place I dreamed of exploring, its vast wilderness promising an escape from the monotony of my life in the city. So when I finally had the chance to take a solo trek through its sprawling, mysterious landscape, I eagerly packed my gear and set out, blissfully unaware that this journey would forever mark me as someone who had seen the unseen and survived, though barely. The first few days were idyllic, the trail unfolding before me in a tapestry of autumn golds and fiery reds, the air crisp and alive with the scent of pine and earth. But as the miles stretched on and the crowds thinned, I began to feel an unsettling quiet creeping into my bones, the kind of silence that makes you question whether you are truly alone. On the third night, as I set up camp near an old fire ring surrounded by mossy stones, I heard it for the first time. A faint clicking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like the tapping of skeletal fingers on wood, just beyond the range of my headlamp. Dismissing it as some nocturnal creature foraging in the underbrush, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep, But the sound persisted, growing louder and more erratic, until it seemed to circle my campsite in an almost predatory rhythm. When I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my light into the darkness, the forest was unnervingly still, the clicking silenced as though it had never existed, leaving me questioning my own sanity. The following day, the trail felt different, the familiar blazes marking the path becoming scarcer, and the dense foliage seeming to close in tighter, casting shadows that danced and shifted in ways that made my skin crawl. Around midday, I came across a peculiar sight, a crude wooden carving of a figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, hanging from a tree by a fraying rope. The sight filled me with an inexplicable dread, but I convinced myself it was the work of some eccentric hiker or local artist, and I pressed on, though I couldn't shake the feeling that those hollow eyes were following me. That night, I made camp earlier than usual, the oppressive atmosphere of the forest sapping my resolve, and as darkness fell, the clicking returned, louder and closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that seemed to resonate from the ground itself. Heart pounding, I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching the knife I'd brought more for peace of mind than practical use. And as the hours dragged on, the sounds became more distinct, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the leaves, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from just beyond the reach of my hearing. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep, only to wake just before dawn to find strange symbols etched into the dirt around my tent. Symbols that resembled the figure I'd seen carved in the tree. Shaking with fear, I packed up and moved as quickly as I could, desperate to leave this cursed stretch of trail behind. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to resist my presence, the path growing more overgrown and difficult to navigate. By the fifth day, I was hopelessly lost, the trail markers completely gone, replaced by crude wooden effigies and more of those eerie symbols carved into trees and rocks. The whispers grew louder, no longer faint but distinct, though the words were in a language I couldn't comprehend, and the footsteps no longer stayed at a distance, instead following me relentlessly, always just out of sight. As night fell, I stumbled into a clearing where a massive stone altar stood, its surface slick with something dark and viscous that glistened in the moonlight. Surrounding the altar were dozens of the wooden effigies, arranged in a circle, their hollow eyes seeming to stare directly at me. And as I stood there, paralyzed with terror, the forest came alive with movement. Shadows emerged from the trees, humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long and their faces devoid of features save for glowing, amber eyes that seemed to pierce through me. They moved with an unnatural grace, their heads cocking at odd angles as they closed in, and the clicking sound I'd heard every night now emanated from them, a bone-chilling rhythm that seemed to reverberate through my very soul. In a blind panic, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and those things as possible. But no matter how far I ran, the clicking and whispers followed, an unrelenting chorus of terror that seemed to come from all directions at once. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I tripped and fell, the impact knocking the wind out of me and leaving me sprawled in the dirt. As I struggled to catch my breath, I realized the forest had gone silent again, the oppressive noise replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow even worse. When I looked up, I saw them, dozens of the shadowy figures standing in a circle around me, their glowing eyes fixed on me as their clicking intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo that seemed to vibrate through my skull. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. But then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, leaving me alone in the clearing with only the faint echo of their whispers lingering in the air. Somehow, I managed to find my way back to a familiar stretch of trail, though it felt more like the forest had decided to let me go rather than any skill or effort on my part. And when I finally emerged from the woods and stumbled into the nearest town, I was a shadow of the person who had entered, my clothes torn, my body bruised, and my mind haunted by the things I'd seen. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear the clicking in the dead of night, a reminder that the silent stalkers are never far, and I know deep down that I'll never truly escape the horrors of the Appalachian Trail. When I first stepped onto the Appalachian Trail, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, the kind that fills your lungs with crisp air and your mind with the promise of adventure. But little did I know that my journey would unravel into a nightmare that would leave me questioning not just my sanity, but the very nature of reality itself. It started innocently enough, the trail winding through dense forests and open ridges, the occasional fellow hiker offering a wave or a nod. But as the days passed and the traffic on the trail thinned, a peculiar stillness began to settle around me. A quiet so profound it seemed to swallow the sounds of my footsteps and the rustling of leaves. By the third day, I started noticing the whispers, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like a gentle breeze brushing past my ears. But as the hours dragged on, they grew more distinct, forming fragmented words and phrases that seemed to call my name. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was the wind playing tricks on my mind or the distant murmur of an unseen stream. But that night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers grew louder, circling my campsite like an unseen predator stalking its prey. I didn't sleep much that night, and when dawn finally broke, I packed up and moved as quickly as I could, determined to leave whatever was haunting that stretch of the trail behind. But the whispers followed me, their tone shifting from curious to accusing, their words growing sharper and more insistent. By the fifth day, I was completely alone, or at least I thought I was. The other hikers had disappeared, and even the wildlife seemed to have abandoned the area, leaving me with nothing but the oppressive silence and the relentless whispers that now filled every waking moment. I began to notice other oddities too. Trees that seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking, shadows that stretched and twisted in unnatural ways, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Though no matter how quickly I turned or how carefully I scanned the woods, I never saw anything out of the ordinary. The turning point came on the sixth night when I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite deep in the woods. Its fire pit cold and its tent collapsed as though whoever had been there had left in a hurry. Scattered among the debris were scraps of paper covered in frantic, scrawled handwriting. The words incoherent but filled with a palpable sense of dread. Phrases like "they're in the trees" and "don't listen to them" repeated over and over again. As I stood there, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices shouting over one another, their words overlapping in a way that made my head throb and my vision blur. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just whispers. They were warnings, though whether they were meant to help me or drive me mad, I couldn't tell. That night, I didn't bother setting up camp. I kept walking, my flashlight casting long, jittery beams through the forest as the voices seemed to close in around me, their words taking on a menacing edge that made my blood run cold. They spoke of things I couldn't possibly know, secrets I had buried deep within myself, regrets and fears I had tried to forget. And as they laid bare the darkest corners of my soul, I began to feel as though the forest itself was alive, feeding on my despair. By the seventh day, I was completely lost, the trail markers vanishing as though they had never been there, replaced by twisted, gnarled trees that seemed to mock my every step. My food was running low, my water nearly gone, and the whispers had become a constant presence, their words now accompanied by faint laughter that seemed to echo from the shadows. Desperation drove me deeper into the forest, and that's when I saw it. A massive stone structure hidden among the trees, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings that seemed to pulse and writhe in the dim light. Drawn to it by some inexplicable force, I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the stone. And the moment my fingers made contact, the world around me dissolved into chaos. The whispers became screams, the forest spinning around me as though caught in a vortex, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and buckle, sending me crashing to my knees. When the madness finally subsided, I found myself standing in a clearing I didn't recognize. The stone structure gone and the forest eerily silent, but I wasn't alone. Surrounding me were figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured but their presence undeniable. And as they closed in, their whispers returned, now a low, guttural chant that sent shivers down my spine. I don't remember much of what happened next, only fragments. A blinding light, the sensation of being pulled in every direction at once, and the sound of my own voice screaming into the void. When I came to, I was lying on the side of the trail, my gear scattered around me and my body covered in cuts and bruises I couldn't explain. A group of hikers found me and helped me back to civilization, but no one could explain how I had ended up so far off the trail or why I had been missing for nearly 2 weeks when to me, it had felt like only a few days. Even now, months later, the memories haunt me, the whispers still echoing in my mind when I'm alone, and every now and then, I catch glimpses of shadowy figures in the corners of my vision, watching, waiting, as though the forest isn't quite finished with me yet. When I set out to hike the Appalachian Trail, I imagined weeks of solitude, the rhythmic crunch of boots on soil, and nights under a canopy of stars. But what I experienced instead was a descent into a nightmare that haunts me even now, long after I left the trail behind. It began on the 30th day of my journey, deep in a part of the forest locals referred to in hushed tones as Black Hollow, a place shrouded in old folklore about vanishing hikers, strange lights, and voices that called out in the night. I was stubborn, dismissing the warnings as nonsense meant to scare outsiders, and pushed ahead into the area despite the heavy unease that hung in the air. The forest here felt different, older, as if the trees had witnessed things no human ever should. Their twisted branches seemed to reach for me, and the underbrush grew thick and tangled, forcing me to tread carefully. By the time the sun began to sink, the trail had become a narrow path choked by shadows, and I realized with a pang of dread that I hadn't seen a single trail marker for hours. Setting up camp on the edge of a murky creek, I tried to shake off the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I lay cocooned in my sleeping bag, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. Not even the crickets sang here. Sometime after midnight, I awoke to the sound of faint footsteps crunching on the leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, hoping it was just an animal passing by. The steps circled my tent, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a faint, raspy whisper that sent chills racing down my spine. "Not yours, not yours." The voice hissed, barely audible but undeniably human. Heart hammering, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the thin fabric of the tent. The beam revealed nothing, but the footsteps stopped. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the frigid air. The forest was unnervingly still, the crescent moon casting faint light through the gaps in the canopy. My flashlight swept across the clearing, but there was no one there. Then I saw them, footprints, bare human footprints, pressed deep into the mud, circling my tent in tight loops before vanishing into the woods. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm, retreating to the tent and zipping it up tight. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when dawn finally broke, the woods looked less sinister but no less oppressive. Determined to leave Black Hollow behind, I packed up quickly and set off, but the unease followed me. The trail twisted and turned, the dense forest swallowing all sound except for the rhythmic thud of my boots. By midday, the whispers started again, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with every step. I couldn't pinpoint their source. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees. "Go back, not yours." The voices chanted in unison, an unnatural, otherworldly chorus. I broke into a run, my pack bouncing against my back, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. When I stumbled into a clearing, I froze. Ahead of me, hanging from the trees like grotesque ornaments, were ragged bundles of cloth and bones. They swayed gently, though there was no wind. The clearing reeked of decay, and the ground was littered with strange symbols carved into the dirt. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my legs felt rooted in place as the whispers coalesced into a single, guttural growl. A shadow emerged from the far side of the clearing, tall and impossibly thin, its form shifting and flickering as though it wasn't fully part of this world. Its eyes glowed an unnatural white, piercing through the gloom. The creature raised a hand, or what passed for one, and pointed at me. The growl turned into words, low and guttural. "Not yours, never leave." The air seemed to thicken, crushing me with a suffocating weight as the ground beneath me began to writhe, the symbols glowing faintly with an eerie greenish light. Somehow, I managed to move, stumbling backward and breaking into a desperate sprint. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around me, branches clawing at my skin and pack. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and tearing through thorny underbrush, the creature's growl echoing in my ears. "Never leave, not yours," it repeated, a chant that grew louder with every second. When I finally burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road, I collapsed, gasping for air. The whispers and growls were gone, replaced by the distant chirping of birds. A passing hiker found me hours later, disheveled and trembling, and led me to a ranger station. When I tried to explain what had happened, the rangers exchanged uneasy glances. "You must have wandered into Black Hollow," one of them said, his voice low. "Folks around here avoid that place. Been bad stories for centuries. People going in and never coming out, strange sightings, weird sounds. You're lucky you made it out at all." Lucky. That word again. I didn't feel lucky. Even now, months later, I wake up in cold sweats, the whispers still echoing in my dreams. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows that vanish when I turn to look. And at night, in the quietest hours, I swear I can still hear the faint, raspy chant, "Not yours, never leave." The Appalachian Trail was supposed to be my escape from the chaos of modern life, a chance to strip away the noise of the world and reconnect with something primal and untouched. But I never could have anticipated that it would lead me to a nightmare that feels like it has no end. Even now as I sit here, scribbling this with trembling hands, I set out alone, as I had so many times before on smaller trails, armed with a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last 2 weeks, my spirit brimming with the thrill of adventure and solitude. The first few days were uneventful, even idyllic, as I made my way through a landscape that felt more alive than anywhere else I had ever been. Birds sang, leaves rustled in the gentle wind, and the distant babble of streams filled my ears like a soothing soundtrack. But on the 4th day, something changed. The trail seemed less defined, the trees more densely packed, their branches intertwining above me to create a canopy so thick that only thin, weak shafts of sunlight pierced through, and the air grew colder, heavier, as though I had crossed an invisible boundary into a place that wasn't meant to be found. It started with subtle things. A strange silence that replaced the usual forest sounds, shadows that seemed to linger just a moment too long, and a peculiar feeling that I was no longer alone, even though I hadn't seen another soul for days. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of exhaustion and too much solitude. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and that knowledge grew like a dark seed planted in my gut. Then I found the stone markers, crude and ancient-looking, standing in a rough circle just off the path, their surfaces etched with runes or symbols that I couldn't understand but that filled me with an instinctive dread, as though they were not meant to be seen by human eyes. I tried to ignore them, quickening my pace to put as much distance between myself and that eerie sight as possible. But no matter how far I walked, the feeling of being watched persisted, and the woods seemed to grow darker, quieter, as though holding their breath. That night, I couldn't bring myself to light a fire. Something about the flickering glow felt like it would only draw attention to me. So I sat in the darkness, clutching my knife and staring into the impenetrable black, my ears straining to catch any sound. Around midnight, I heard it. A soft, wet rustling, like something dragging itself through the underbrush, coming closer and closer until it stopped just outside the perimeter of my campsite. I held my breath, every muscle in my body taut as a bowstring, and for what felt like hours, there was only silence. Then came the whispering, faint, guttural, and impossibly close, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The words, if they were words, were in no language I could understand, and they seemed to seep into my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the sun was rising, and I was lying several feet from where I had been, my belongings scattered as though someone, or something, had rifled through them while I was unconscious. I wanted to turn back, to abandon the trail and return to the safety of civilization, but when I looked at my map, I realized with a sinking dread that it didn't match the terrain around me anymore, and no matter which direction I walked, I couldn't find my way back to a recognizable landmark. The days blurred together after that, each one more surreal and terrifying than the last as the forest seemed to close in around me, its trees twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed like silent sentinels. The whispers returned every night, growing louder and more insistent, and I began to see shapes in the darkness. Pale, elongated figures that moved unnaturally, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence that made my blood run cold. On the 8th day, I stumbled upon a clearing dominated by an enormous tree unlike any I had ever seen, its bark black as charcoal and its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. At its base was a doorway carved into the wood, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, and though every instinct screamed at me to stay away, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, as if the tree itself were calling me. When I stepped through the doorway, I found myself in a cavern lit by a sickly green light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. And in the center of the cavern was a pool of water so dark it looked like liquid shadow. Floating in the water were hundreds of objects: backpacks, boots, tents, and other gear, all in various states of decay, as though they had been there for years, and among them were bones, some small and animal-like, others unmistakably human. As I stood there, frozen in horror, a low, guttural growl echoed through the cavern, and from the shadows emerged a figure that defied description, its body a shifting mass of darkness with eyes that burned like embers. It spoke without speaking, its voice reverberating in my mind, filling it with images of despair, suffering, and a trail that stretched endlessly through a nightmarish landscape. I turned and ran, my only thought to escape, but the forest above had changed, its paths twisting and looping back on themselves until I realized there was no way out. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping voices that mocked and begged and screamed, and the figures in the shadows grew bolder, stepping closer with each passing hour until they surrounded me, their faces blank and featureless except for those burning eyes. I don't know how long I wandered, hours, days, maybe weeks, but eventually, I stumbled out of the woods and into a small town, my clothes in tatters and my body covered in scratches and bruises. When I tried to tell the townsfolk what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances and told me no one had hiked that section of the trail in decades, not since a series of disappearances had led to its closure. They didn't believe me, of course, and maybe I wouldn't either if I hadn't brought something back with me. A single blackened stone etched with those strange symbols, a stone I now keep hidden in a drawer because every time I look at it, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable, and I know the trail is still watching, waiting for me to return. I had always heard the Appalachian Trail was a place to find yourself, a stretch of wilderness that could heal the spirit and calm the soul. But when I set out on my solo journey one early autumn morning, I had no idea I would discover not peace, but a nightmare so consuming it would linger with me like a scar burned into my memory. The first days were serene, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the gentle rustle of wind in the trees lulling me into a sense of calm as I followed the well-marked path, my mind free from the chaos of everyday life. But that serenity began to crumble when I encountered an abandoned cabin just off the trail, its windows dark and empty like unblinking eyes staring into my soul. Something about the way the air seemed heavier near that cabin made me hesitate, but curiosity drew me closer, my footsteps hesitant as I approached the creaking door that hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, and on the floor lay a journal, its pages warped and its words scrawled in a frantic, uneven hand warning of the watchers in the woods and the silence that listens back. Dismissing it as the ramblings of a paranoid hiker, I pressed on. But as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening and I set up camp, a prickling unease crept over me, as if the trees were leaning closer, their branches stretching out like fingers longing to touch. That night, the forest felt alive in a way that went beyond the chirping of crickets and the distant hoots of owls. The darkness itself seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting in ways that defied explanation, and though I tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched burrowed into my mind, making sleep an impossible endeavor. By morning, my nerves were frayed, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued my journey. Though with each mile, the trail seemed less familiar, the markers fewer and farther between until I realized I had wandered into a part of the forest that wasn't on my map. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the world in an oppressive twilight, and the whispers started. Not voices exactly, but faint murmurs that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Impossible to pinpoint, like a chorus of ghosts singing just beyond the edge of hearing. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my pride and the sinking realization that I might already be lost pushed me forward, my footsteps quickening as I tried to shake the feeling of invisible eyes tracking my every move. On the fourth day, I stumbled upon a clearing unlike any I had seen before. Its center dominated by a massive tree with gnarled roots that twisted and writhed like serpents, and at its base was a pile of stones arranged in a crude circle, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as I approached. I felt a pull, a compulsion to step closer, and as I did, the whispers grew louder, their words becoming clearer until I could make out phrases like, "He is here," and "the door opens." Panic surged through me, and I turned to flee, but the forest had changed. What had once been a clear trail was now an impenetrable wall of trees, their trunks so tightly packed together I couldn't squeeze through. Desperation set in as I retraced my steps, only to find the clearing again and again, as though the forest were a labyrinth shifting around me to keep me trapped. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, my water supply dwindled, and my mind began to spiral as the days blurred together, each one marked by a growing sense of dread and the whispers that now never ceased, their tone oscillating between mocking and pleading. The seventh night was when everything shattered. As I sat huddled by a fire that did little to banish the oppressive darkness, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, coalescing into shapes that defied logic, tall, angular figures with elongated limbs and faces that were almost human but twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. They didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating, their silent gazes drilling into me as the whispers rose to a deafening roar that seemed to come from within my own head. I ran, though I don't know how or where I found the strength, crashing blindly through the forest as the figures pursued me, their movements unervingly smooth and fast despite their towering forms. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I tripped and fell, landing hard on the forest floor beside what looked like an old, rusted trapdoor set into the ground. Without thinking, I wrenched it open and climbed down into the darkness, slamming it shut above me as the whispers abruptly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had paused. The air was damp and cold, and as I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam revealed a narrow tunnel lined with roots that seemed to pulse faintly, like veins carrying some dark lifeblood through the earth. I had no choice but to follow it, my every step echoing in the oppressive silence, until I emerged into a cavern lit by a sickly green glow emanating from a massive pool of water at its center. Shapes moved beneath the surface, their forms too indistinct to describe but radiating a malevolence that made my skin crawl, and as I backed away, I felt something brush against my shoulder. Turning slowly, I saw one of the shadow figures standing inches away, its face now clear and horrifyingly familiar. It was my own face, twisted into a grotesque grin that didn't match the terror I felt. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the pool, and I felt an invisible force dragging me forward, my feet sliding across the ground despite my struggles. And as I reached the edge, the whispers returned, louder than ever, chanting in unison as the water began to bubble and churn. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the cavern, and then I fell, plunging into the icy depths as the shadows closed in around me, their laughter the last thing I heard before everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the trail where I had started, my gear untouched and my body unharmed, but the forest was silent, the kind of silence that listens back, and as I stood and looked around, I saw the symbols from the clearing carved into the trees, a reminder that whatever happened wasn't just a nightmare. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can feel the forest's eyes on me, and every so often, I hear the whispers in the quiet corners of my mind, a haunting reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed.